Hello everybody, welcome back for another frightening Friday. I hope you had a fantastic week. Let's kickstart the weekend off with a very creepy story. Go and get your drink, your Friday night drink, or your snack. Get cozy, and I'll be right back while I go and grab mine. Okay, so I made probably the simplest drink I could. I've been wanting to kind of play around more with the blue carousel. And look at that beautiful color. It looks like a tropical aquarium or something. So this was just an ounce of curacao, an ounce of vodka, and then 4 ounces of, it was supposed to be lemon juice, but I did 4 ounces of sparkling orange water. So I'm kind of nervous. For some reason it might not taste good, but I don't really see how that would be possible. So cheers to you and cheers to Friday. It's a little strong, not gonna lie. I think you're supposed to use lemonade because it would add quite a bit of sweetness to it. So I don't have any sweetener in here. It's good. I would like it sweeter, but I kind of like that. It's different. It's not too sweet, and I'm used to having sweeter drinks, so we're just gonna go for it. It's really pretty. I like that I can taste the liqueur, so I like that it's not being covered up by sugar. So let's get into the story. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this story legitimately terrified me. And it's funny because it's not necessarily any scarier than other ghost stories. There was just something about it. As I was doing the research for it, I was getting shivers up and down my spine. Like, something about it was just hitting differently for me. I find it very creepy and very sinister. So yeah, this is the only case in history where no person was found guilty of a murder and a ghost was convicted of a murder. Okay, so big chunk of their land for or to like whoever would take it, and they were offering at, okay, I'm just gonna read right off of the thing because I can't get it straight in my head. So in order to make a fast amount of cash, the Bats decided to sell some of their property to pretty much whoever would take it. They were desperate. And John Bell was first in line. He wanted to expand his farmland, and this looked like a good opportunity to him. And I believe the Bats family were kind of hoping that there would be a little bit of a bidding war for their property, but that didn't happen. John Bell offered the asking price, and they sold it to him because they were in trouble, and he got their land for super cheap. And I guess it took Kate a little while to realize that they'd sold this property very much under value. John had basically stolen it from them, and Kate quickly said, I could have got a lot more for our property. Like, what was I thinking? And she went to John Bell and she said, I think you took advantage of me because of our family situation, and I think you should pay us more for the land that we gave you. And John Bell said, no, I gave you asking price. I own it now, it's my land. So he took it, and that was that. But in anger, Kate said to John, I will haunt you and your family until your deaths for taking advantage of my family like this. So, if somebody said something like that to me today, I would be kind of freaked out. But saying something like this in the 1800s was a big no-no. You couldn't just go around telling people that you were gonna curse them or haunt them. never received like the notification, or I don't know how it worked, but he never ended up going to court to like settle the dispute or to fight for himself or whatever. However it would have worked, he didn't go. And so the court ended up settling with the Bats family, basically saying, yeah, they extorted you. Is that a word? I don't know. We agree that this is a case of extortion. So I know that this started a huge feud between the Bats and the Bells, but I don't know exactly what happened afterwards. Okay, so it was also right around this time, after the lawsuit was kind of finished up, that Kate Bats had some sort of weird outburst in church. She wasn't being very ladylike, like she was yelling and being loud, and she was like immediately accused of practicing witchcraft because of her loud outburst of anger. She must be a witch, right? People here even went so far as to say that her husband had been paralyzed and they'd lost all of their money as punishment from God for practicing witchcraft. So yeah, that's what happened to the Bats family. And it was right after this, right after word got around town that Kate Bats may have been a witch, that very scary, very spooky things started happening at the Bell farm. So these were like super bizarre things that were just clearly not of this world. So the first encounter, John was working on the farm one afternoon and he was tending to some of the crops. He's walking on his property when all of a sudden he hears a really loud animal sound. And like, no big deal, right? He lived in the middle of nowhere. He was used to seeing big animals come onto his property. But this animal was one that he had never seen before. It was huge, but it had the body of a dog. So 4 legs, a tail, a deep chest, and thick dark fur, but it had the head of a rabbit. Clearly never seen anything like this before, but this is just when like creepy animals get involved, like some sort of a hybrid between 2 animals. This just creeps me out. John was a hunter, so he had his rifle on him and he shot at this thing because he didn't know what it was and it was looking right at him. So he fired multiple times, saying that he was sure he hit it 3 times, like direct hits. And when he ran over to see what he'd done, it had disappeared into thin air. Just poof, it was gone. And John doesn't know what to think. He keeps the experience to himself because he doesn't want to scare Lucy. He doesn't want to scare their kids. And again, this kind of like supernatural thing, back then you didn't talk about this kind of stuff. You didn't want to make people think that you were practicing weird stuff that went against their religion. Is a big no-no. And honestly, like, I'm such a scaredy cat. If Eric saw some sort of a creepy animal, I wouldn't want him to tell me either, because I'd like never go outside ever again. But whatever this weird thing was, it was kind of like, I took it as like an introduction. Like this weird animal was saying, hello, things are about to get a lot worse for you. I'm only the beginning. That's how I took it. So the night that John saw this animal was the first night that the Bells had a very scary experience. They are all asleep. It is 10 o'clock at night. dogs fighting outside their front door, but when they'd open it, there was nothing there. They would hear boulder-sized rocks being thrown at their windows and their walls, but no damage. Nothing was like breaking through the windows or anything. And they're still thinking this has to be Kate. Like, this is how angry she is with us. But it became pretty darn clear that it wasn't Kate when these creepy sounds started coming from inside of their locked farmhouse at nighttime. I don't know why this story creeps me out so much. So doors in the house would be slammed shut. Scratching could be heard coming from the insides of their walls. The family would hear large chains being dragged across the interior flooring on the inside of the home, and the children would hear rats gnawing on their wooden bedposts, so like right underneath them while they were sleeping. When they would go down or look down, there'd be no bite marks, there'd be no rats, so just super creepy. And perhaps what I think is the scariest part, the whole family would hear a person walking around their house, gulping and choking on something. Those are pretty distinct sounds. Some entity was walking around making gulping sounds. I can't. It's too creepy. So then, if that wasn't bad enough, the entity or whatever was making these sounds actually began physically attacking the family. So while asleep, family members would wake up because their bed sheets and pillows would be violently ripped from them and thrown across the floor, thrown across the room. Again, their pillows would be yanked out from underneath their heads, waking them up pretty violently. And the Bell's children were physically attacked. Their poor little faces were getting scratched. Their hair was being pulled, and they were being poked and pricked by something sharp and something invisible. And it seemed that Betsy, the youngest daughter, for some weird reason, this 14-year-old girl got the worst of the entity's attention. She was getting slapped, pinched, and pricked by this invisible thing, and she was even being bitten. But what I think was the scariest encounter that Betsy had was she woke up one night because her pillow had been yanked out from underneath her head, so her head fell back. And when she sat up to see where her pillow had gone, she couldn't sit up because her hair, her long hair, had been tied to her bed frame behind her, tied in knots. Hello? How creepy is that? And as she tried to get her hair untied, an invisible force sat on her and started slapping her in the face, very violently. And Betsy couldn't defend herself because her hair was tied to the bed. And so all she could do was start screaming as loud as she could for her parents to come in and help her. And when her mother and father got into the room, they rushed in and they saw Betsy with her hair tied behind her, and she had these huge red, hand marks all over her face. The poor girl, I can't even imagine. And everything seemed to just get progressively worse and worse and worse. So more bizarre, really scary animals were being seen around the property. Some of these animals were said to have 2 heads. Some were even headless, and some of them could talk. And maybe this is why this case scares me so much, because she would sing Lucy beautiful songs, especially if she wasn't feeling well, and she never physically harmed Lucy. And she even said to her once that Lucy is the most perfect woman to have ever walked the earth. So I don't know, maybe the spirit or the ghost had a little thing for Lucy. Maybe. I don't know. But she seemed to really like her. And the witch also really liked John Jr. And she was always really nice to him. But despite the witch's selective kindness, she still targeted the rest of the family, including John Sr., and it was getting really bad. But John didn't want to go to anybody for help. Remember, it was a scary time to talk about this sort of thing, and a historian who was talking about the Bell Witch, he said that the family didn't call for help at this point because of the fact that John was an elder of the church, and this was only 123 years after the Salem witch trials, and it was right in the buckle of the Bible Belt. If John had said, "We have a ghost in our house, we need help," people would have just said, "Well, you must be practicing witchcraft. You brought this on yourself. It's your own fault," which would have been horrible enough. But the Bell family was more fearful of retribution and being kicked out of the town, or maybe even being killed for practicing witchcraft. So they had a pretty legit reason at this time for not telling anybody. listened and they urged the Bells to go to the church. They said, you know, you're very well respected. They're gonna listen to you and they're gonna help you. But John still refused. He did not want to involve the church. And so, to offer like a little bit of solace, James and his wife said, okay, how about we come and spend the night and let's see if this spirit is so malicious that she'll actually attack us, who are complete strangers. So a nice little ghost sleepover. James and his wife take one of the bedrooms. They go to sleep and they're awoken by the bed sheets being ripped off of them. James's wife gets attacked. Her hair is pulled. She is slapped by an invisible entity. The whole thing. And then James shouts, "In the name of the Lord, who are you and what do you want?" But they don't get an answer because the Bell Witch is very unforthcoming. So the next morning, James tells John what happened. He says, "We completely believe you," and he urges him again to please go to the church. And this time, John finally agrees, and they go and they talk to a preacher. There's no ice left to do the nice little ice sounds. So the Bell family explains their concerns to the preacher about the rest of the community finding out, and the preacher promises that he won't tell anybody. But apparently he was a liar because word of their haunting quickly went through the grapevine, and pretty much everyone in town knew that the Bell family had a ghost. And I guess you can say like their biggest fear of being called witches, that didn't happen. It was actually kind of the opposite, because people were suddenly flocking to the Bell farm to try and get a look at the witch. Everybody was super curious. So people were just showing up at the Bell's house uninvited to see if they could experience this haunting. And the ghost didn't disappoint. The witch would apparently quote scriptures for whoever was willing to listen. And it's just weird because it's like two conflicting things. She would apparently do that, but then she would get so angry that she would start throwing furniture around right in front of all of these people who swear that they witnessed it. So yeah, furniture would be picked up, thrown across the room for all of these visitors to see. People were getting physically injured, and it was just crazy. Everybody in Red River now legitimately believed that the Bell family was being haunted. And this is also around the time where John Bell happened to remember that weird threat that Kate Batts had made about coming to haunt him and his family. Kate Batts was still alive, but then he connected the dots again and he said, "Oh my god, she might be a witch." So, since everybody around town had been accusing Kate of witchcraft, they go and they talk to Kate, and she adamantly denied having like really disgusting scent that would have been bad enough that he would have just dropped her. So he dropped her on the floor, the sheets fell, and the witch disappeared. So that is a pretty interesting story as well. And a family descendant of William Porter still lives in that area, and like you can find an interview with him, which is, it's crazy. But anyways, the story of the bell haunting became so popular in Tennessee that it reached many places beyond there, and it actually reached the attention of General Andrew Jackson, so the soon-to-be 7th U.S. president. And when word of this crazy haunting got to him, he found out that 3 of the Bell's oldest sons had fought with him, or had fought under him in the Battle of New Orleans. And he decided that this was just so interesting that he just had to go and pay a visit to the Bell farm. He traveled to the farm with a bunch of his men on horseback, and as soon as they reached the Bell property, the horses refused to go any further. It was like they had reached an invisible barrier. They just wouldn't go ahead until a voice that all of the men heard said, "You may proceed. I'll meet you again later tonight." without being able to eat or drink or even talk. His throat would literally swell up to the point where he would say, "Somebody is shoving a stick down my throat." And he couldn't get out of bed. But on the days that he would try to get out of bed, apparently the witch would taunt him and push him down, and then she would laugh at him on his worst days. So most people agree that John Bell was probably suffering from epilepsy or some other neurological disorder, but the whole Bell family thought that this was all the witch. The witch was doing all of this to their father, and John just got weaker and weaker, and on December 20th, 1820, he experienced multiple severe seizures, and he slipped into a coma and he passed away. Now, in his room, the family found a very strange looking glass vial that had some sort of a weird liquid in it, and none of them knew where it had come from. No one knew who put it there. They had never seen it before. And John Jr. gave a tiny little drop of this liquid to a poor farm animal, and that animal died within a minute of lapping up this liquid. So whatever this stuff was obviously poison. And right after they had seen the farm animal die, the witch shouted, "I gave old Jack a dose of that last night," which fixed him good. The Bell family immediately threw this vial of liquid into the fireplace, assuming it was a dark potion from the witch. And when the glass shattered, the liquid exploded, turning into a bright blue flame. A bright blue flame, and then a blue orb emerged from the fire, hovered in the bedroom before flying up the chimney and leaving. So that, that image actually terrifies me. I have shivers going up and down my spine right now. I don't know what it is about witches. I don't like them. I don't like them at all. So the Bell witch murdered John Bell, or at least according to everyone in town, because his death was ruled as due to supernatural causes. Nobody got in trouble, no people. And yeah, John Bell's funeral was apparently one of the largest services that ever took place in Robertson County. And apparently, as the funeral came to a close, and as the casket was being lowered into the ground, as usual, in her menacing, eerie way, the Bell Witch started whispering. Nobody could make out what she was saying, but she started cackling with laughter as the casket was being lowered into the ground. And then she started singing drinking songs as if this was a happy, joyous occasion. And she continued singing until the last person left the graveyard. So after John's death, the family was relieved because the hauntings actually stopped for a little while. But the witch came back with a vengeance, and she returned to break up Betsy's engagement. What the hell was this witch's deal? Just let the poor couple get married. Richard got married. Like, what? I don't know. It's super suspicious. I don't know what is going on there, and I wish that there were more details on this story because I just need to know what happened there. So after the engagement was broken off, the hauntings stopped. The Bell Witch apparently visited Lucy and her children that were still living there like 2 more times. And on one of the visits, the Bell Witch told one of the sons that she had a good reason for killing John Sr., which was because he was a bad man. So this just leads us to, like, who was the Bell Witch? Like, where did she come from, right? And there are so many different theories going on to who this thing was, where it came from. So one we've already gone over. Could it have been Kate Batts calling upon a spirit out of revenge? 2, some people think that John Bell had actually had a business partner back in Nashville and he had murdered him. So some people think that the Bell Witch was actually the spirit of his business partner haunting him. And maybe this actually makes sense because she apparently admitted to killing him because he was a bad man. I don't know. There were the rumors about Richard Powell summoning a demon to make Betsy fall in love with him. Some sort of dark magical blackmail, I guess. And then 4, there were tales of the Bell Witch being a spirit of a Native American woman who had actually lived on the property at one time. So it's said